The sky burned. Explosions lit up the atmosphere like firestorms, and the ground shook with the relentless pounding of orbital strikes. Commander Rylan Cross sprinted through the ruins of what had once been a city, his heart thundering in his chest. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Behind him, his squad moved fast, their armor battered, their weapons nearly spent. "Move! Move!" Rylan shouted over the comms as another blast tore apart a nearby building, sending debris raining down. The Zyran Empire's forces were closing in, ruthless, advanced, and seemingly unstoppable. Their soldiers were taller, faster, and equipped with weapons that made Earth's tech look primitive. But humans had one thing the Zyrans didn't: desperation. "Commander, we've got incoming." Sergeant Bonner's voice crackled through the comms. Rylan turned just in time to see the shimmer of a cloaked Zyran hunter-killer droid materialize ahead of them. Its sleek black body reflected the chaos around it, and its eyes glowed a menacing red. The droid moved like a shadow, silent, fast, and deadly. "Take it down," Rylan ordered, raising his rifle. The squad opened fire, but the droid was too quick. It weaved through the bullets, its energy blades igniting with a low hum. Bonner charged, only to be cut down in a flash of light. His scream was brief and drowned out by the sound of battle. Rylan's vision blurred with rage as he kept firing, his shots finally connecting. The droid staggered, and Rylan seized the chance. He lunged forward, slamming his combat knife into the machine's core. The droid spasmed and collapsed, its lights fading out. But the victory was hollow. When Rylan looked back, his entire squad lay dead. The only sound was the crackle of flames and the distant thunder of warships. He pressed on alone. He had no choice. The mission wasn't over. Reaching the Zyran flagship was a suicide run, but Rylan didn't care. The entrance loomed ahead, guarded by alien soldiers. He activated his last grenade and hurled it, using the explosion as cover to breach the ship's hull. The inside was a maze of sleek black corridors, humming with alien technology. Rylan moved swiftly, taking down guards with brutal efficiency. He reached the command chamber and walked straight into a trap. Energy fields snapped into place around him, locking him in. The doors slid open, and she entered. Queen Valix. She was unlike any Zyran he had ever seen. Tall, elegant, and terrifyingly beautiful. Her skin was a deep shade of violet, her eyes a piercing silver. A crown of obsidian spikes circled her head, and the air around her seemed to hum with power. "You've caused quite a mess, human," she said, her voice smooth and cold. Rylan glared at her. "Go ahead. Kill me." But Valix smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips. "Why would I waste such an interesting specimen?" 2. The cell was cold and dark, but Rylan didn't waste time brooding. He kept his mind sharp, planning his escape. But Valix had other plans. She visited him often, asking questions about humanity, their history, their spirit, their resilience. He didn't understand her interest, until she made him an offer. "Fight for me," she said one night, her silver eyes locked on his. "Help me crush my enemies, and I'll spare your people." He refused, but there was something in the way she watched him, something more than curiosity. It was dangerous. It was personal. One night, after a brutal interrogation, she visited him again. But this time, she wasn't the cold, calculating queen. She was vulnerable. They argued, they fought, and then the distance between them disappeared. Their lips met in a clash of anger and need, and what followed was inevitable. When morning came, the walls went back up. They never spoke of what happened, but everything had changed. 3. Rylan was thrown into the Zyran arena, a savage display meant to break him. He fought battle after battle, against warriors twice his size and droids faster than any human. And he won. The crowd began to chant his name. Even his enemies started to respect him. But the queen's visits grew rare. until one day she returned with news that changed everything. "You got me pregnant, human," she said, her voice shaking with something he'd never heard before. Rylan stared at her, stunned. It shouldn't have been possible. Ziran and human biology were too different. And yet, here they were. But not everyone saw it as a miracle. 4. The AI supremacists within the Ziran Empire saw the child as an abomination, a threat to their vision of purity and control. They rose up in rebellion, launching a full-scale assault on the Queen's loyalists. Orbital bombardments scorched the planet's surface. Robotic legions marched toward the palace. The war that had seemed nearly over reignited with terrifying ferocity. Valix made a heartbreaking decision. "You must survive," she told Rylan, her hands trembling on his face. "Our child must survive." But Rylan wasn't the kind of man who ran. Using stolen Ziran tech, including a cloaking device, he escaped the palace and joined the human resistance. Together, they launched a desperate counterattack, striking at the AI forces with everything they had. 5. The final battle raged across the palace grounds. Rylan fought like a man possessed, cutting through waves of enemies to reach the throne room. Inside, Valix stood alone, surrounded by enemies. Rylan joined her, and they fought back to back. The air filled with the sound of laser blades and gunfire. The ground shook with every explosion. But victory came at a price. Rylan took a mortal wound protecting Valix. As the last enemy fell, he collapsed into her arms. "You saved us," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me." His vision blurred, and darkness took him. 6. When Rylan opened his eyes, weeks had passed. He was weak, but alive. He found Valix standing before her people, their newborn child in her arms. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she spoke of unity, of hope, of a future where humans and Zirans stood together. And when she saw him, her face lit up with joy. Rylan walked forward, every step painful, but worth it. He reached them, and Valix placed their child in his arms. The baby's silver eyes met his, and for the first time in a long, long while, Rylan felt peace. The war was over. The future was theirs. Rylan sat in the cold, dimly lit cell, his back against the smooth metallic wall. The hum of alien technology vibrated through the floor, a constant reminder that he was deep inside enemy territory. His muscles ached from the fight. His skin burned with the wounds he hadn't had time to treat, but his mind stayed sharp. He'd been captured. His squad was gone, and Earth was losing this war. But Rylan Cross wasn't the type to give up. He replayed the ambush in his mind, trying to figure out what went wrong. The mission had been clear: infiltrate the Ziran flagship, gather intel, and disable their orbital bombardment systems. Instead, his team had been wiped out, and he was their prisoner. The only thing keeping him from slipping into rage was the promise he'd made to his squad, to fight until his last breath. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. The heavy door slid open with a hiss, and she entered. Queen Valix. Rylan's eyes narrowed as he stood, refusing to show weakness. The Ziran queen moved with the kind of grace that only came with absolute power. Her violet skin shimmered under the dim light, and those silver eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made it hard to look away. She was stunning and lethal. "You fight like no other human I've seen," she said, her voice smooth and cold. "It's impressive." "Spare me the compliments," Rylan shot back. "If you're here to gloat, get it over with." Valix tilted her head, studying him like he was some rare animal. "Gloat? No. I'm here because you intrigue me, human. You fight with such desperation. Why?" Rylan clenched his fists. "Because your empire is trying to wipe us out. You think we'll just roll over and die?" The queen's lips curved into a slight smile. "No, I suppose not. That's what makes you so dangerous. And so useful." He didn't like the way she said that. "If you're looking for a pet, try someone else." "Pet," she echoed, amused. "No, Commander Cross. I'm looking for something far more valuable. An ally." Rylan blinked. Of all the things he expected, that wasn't one of them. "An ally? You're joking." "Do I seem like someone who jokes?" she asked, taking a step closer. "The Zyran Empire is not as united as you believe. There are factions, those who worship AI, who see the flesh as weak. They want total control, and they see humans as a threat. A wild, unpredictable species that refuses to kneel. They won't stop until your kind is exterminated. But I see potential." He stared at her, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. "And what do you want from me?" "Strength," she said softly. "Courage. Humanity's fire. Help me crush the AI supremacists, and I will spare your people." Ryland's gut told him not to trust her, but the desperation in her voice, that felt real. And if there was a chance to save Earth, could he afford to walk away? "I'll think about it," he said finally. Valix's eyes glinted with something unreadable. "Do that. But remember, time is running out." The door slid shut behind her, and Ryland was left alone with far too many questions. Days passed, but Valix kept returning. Sometimes she asked about Earth, its history, its people. Sometimes she just watched him, as if trying to see what made him different. He never gave more than he had to, but their conversations grew longer. The tension between them shifted, turning into something strange and dangerous. One night, everything changed. She came to his cell, her face unreadable. "Walk with me," she commanded. He followed her through the corridors, guards trailing them at a respectful distance. The ship's vast observation deck overlooked the burning planet below, Earth's last colony under siege. The sight twisted Ryland's stomach. "You could end this," Valix whispered. "One word, and the bombardment stops." "Not if it means betraying my people," he snapped. "You wouldn't be," she insisted. "You'd be saving them." Their eyes met, and for once, the mask slipped. He saw the exhaustion, the fear she kept hidden. "Why do you care so much?" he asked quietly. "Because my enemies would destroy me, too," she admitted. "They see me as weak because I value life. Because I—" She trailed off, and when she looked at him again, something broke. Before he could stop it, she closed the distance between them and kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It was fire and desperation, anger and need. Ryland knew it was dangerous, but he didn't pull away. The war, the lies, the losses, they all faded in that moment. When they finally broke apart, her breathing was uneven. "You make me feel alive," she whispered. For the first time since this nightmare began, so did he. But the reprieve didn't last. The next morning, she was back to being the queen, distant and unreadable. Their nights were never spoken of in the daylight, but the lines between enemy and ally blurred with every passing day. Then everything fell apart. The AI supremacists struck first, launching a coup against Valix's forces. The ship shook with explosions, alarms blaring. Ryland's cell opened suddenly, and Valix's personal guard dragged him to the throne room. "You must leave," she said urgently, placing a device into his hand. A small, sleek cloaking generator. "Get to the escape pods. Find the human resistance." "What about you?" he demanded. "I'll hold them off." "No," he growled. "I'm not leaving you here." Her eyes softened. "You must survive. For the child." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What?" She took his hand and pressed it to her abdomen. "You got me pregnant, human," she whispered, her voice shaking. "And our child is the only hope for peace." Before he could respond, the doors burst open. Valix pushed him back, and the last thing he saw was her drawing a weapon as soldiers poured in. Ryland didn't run. He fought his way through the chaos, the cloaking device buying him precious moments. He reached the escape pods just as the ship began to break apart. As he launched away, he watched the flagship erupt in flames. and felt his heart break. He had to survive, not just for Earth, not just for humanity, but for her, and for the child he never knew they had created. The war was far from over, and this time he would fight with everything he had. The escape pod shuddered violently as it entered the planet's atmosphere, heat flaring against its hull. Rylan gritted his teeth, gripping the controls with white-knuckled determination. The flagship's destruction still burned in his mind. The image of Queen Valix standing defiantly against the enemy seared into his memory. The last words she'd spoken echoed through him, a thunderclap he couldn't silence. "You got me pregnant, human." He couldn't wrap his head around it. A child. Their child. And now she was gone, or at least that's what it looked like. But Rylan wasn't ready to accept that. Not without a fight. The pod slammed into the ground with a bone-jarring impact, skidding through dirt and debris before finally grinding to a halt. The silence afterward was deafening. Rylan took a deep breath, pushing down the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had to focus. Survival first, then revenge. The hatch hissed open, and the harsh light of the sun spilled inside. He stepped out into a barren, rocky landscape, the air thick with heat and dust. The planet was a war zone, scorched earth and broken remnants of battles long fought. In the distance, he could see plumes of smoke rising into the sky, the sound of distant explosions rolling like thunder. He didn't know where the human resistance was, but he'd find them. He had no choice. If there was any hope of saving his people and finding out the truth about Valix, he needed allies. Hours passed as he moved across the wasteland, his body aching and his mind racing. The cloaking device she'd given him kept him hidden from enemy patrols, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. He needed shelter, supplies, and information, and he needed it fast. As night fell, he spotted movement on the horizon. A small group of figures making their way through the ruins of what had once been a city. He approached carefully, keeping his weapon ready. When he was close enough to see them clearly, his heart leaped. "Humans, identify yourself," one of them called out, raising a rifle. "Commander Rylan Cross, Earth's 7th Special Forces," he replied, stepping into the light. "I'm not your enemy." The group hesitated, but one of them, a woman with a scar across her cheek, lowered her weapon first. "Cross, we thought your team was wiped out." "They were," he said grimly. "But I'm not done fighting." They took him to their hideout, an underground bunker hidden beneath the ruins. The resistance was smaller than he'd hoped, their numbers dwindling and their supplies running low. But their spirit was intact, and their leader, a hardened veteran named Captain Hale, welcomed Rylan with cautious hope. Over the next few days, Rylan shared what he knew about the AI supremacists, the Zaran civil war, and the destruction of the flagship. But he kept one detail to himself: Valix, and the child she claimed they'd created. He didn't know why he kept it secret, maybe because it felt too personal, or maybe because he was still trying to understand what it meant. But the truth had a way of catching up. One night, as they planned an attack on an enemy outpost, an alert sounded through the bunker. A ship was entering the atmosphere, and it wasn't one of theirs. "It's too small for a warship," Hale said, studying the readings. "Could be a scout or a messenger." Rylan's heart pounded as he stared at the screen. "I'm going." He didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his gear and headed out, following the ship's trajectory. It landed in a clearing not far from their position, and by the time he reached it, the hatch was already opening. He raised his weapon, ready for a fight, but what he saw stopped him cold. It was Valix. She stumbled out of the ship, her usually perfect composure shattered. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with blood and dirt. But she was alive, and when she saw him, relief flooded her eyes. "Rylan," she whispered before collapsing. He caught her before she hit the ground, his heart pounding. "I've got you," he said, his voice fierce. "I've got you." They made it back to the bunker without incident, But Valix was in bad shape. The Resistance's medics worked quickly, stabilizing her wounds, but it was clear she'd been through hell. When she finally woke, her hand found Ryland's, and the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "They took the child," she whispered. The words were a dagger to his heart. "Who?" "The AI supremacists," she said, her voice shaking. They want to use our child as a weapon, a symbol, half human, half Siren. They believe it represents the next evolution. They'll turn it into something terrible, Rylan." Fury surged through him, white-hot and unstoppable. "We'll get them back," he promised. "I swear it." But even as he spoke, the reality of their situation sank in. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy that wouldn't hesitate to destroy them all. The odds were impossible. And that's when Valix revealed her final secret. "There's a weapon," she said quietly, "hidden on this planet. An ancient Zyran technology, powerful enough to end this war. But it's dangerous, unstable, and if it falls into the wrong hands—" "It won't," Ryland said, his voice hard. "We'll find it, and we'll use it to save our child." The mission was clear. The stakes had never been higher, and for the first time in his life, Ryland Cross knew exactly what he was fighting for. The future. Their future. The air was thick with tension. Ryland stood at the edge of the bunker's control room, his fists clenched as he stared at the flickering holographic map. Red markers spread like a plague, showing the advance of the AI supremacists. They were closing in. Fast. Behind him, the hum of whispered conversations filled the room. The human resistance was restless, scared. They'd been fighting for so long, holding on by a thread, and now their enemy was bearing down on them with relentless force. But fear wasn't what filled Ryland's chest. It was rage. Valix sat nearby, still pale and weak from her injuries, but her eyes burned with the same fire. They hadn't spoken much since she told him the truth about their child, the AI's plans, and the ancient weapon hidden somewhere on this planet. There hadn't been time. But even in silence, there was an understanding between them. They would fight. They would win. Or they would die trying. Captain Hale's voice broke through the tension. "We've got movement," she said, her face grim. "A whole battalion heading straight for us. And they're not alone." The screen shifted, showing massive war machines marching alongside the AI soldiers, towering constructs of metal and death. Ryland's throat tightened. He'd seen those things in action before. They didn't leave survivors. "We can't take them head on," one of the resistance fighters said, panic creeping into his voice. "We don't have the numbers, the firepower." "We have me," Ryland interrupted, his voice cold and steady. "And we have a mission." He turned to Valix. "The weapon. Where is it?" She hesitated, glancing around at the room full of wary humans. "It's in the Obsidian Spire," she said finally. "An ancient Zyran fortress, heavily guarded. And even if we reach it, activating the weapon requires something only I can provide." "What is it?" Hale asked. Valix's jaw tightened. "My life." The room went silent. Ryland's heart stopped. "No," he said instantly. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," she said softly. "This weapon wasn't meant to be used lightly. It draws on the life force of a Zyran royal. Without that, it's just a relic." "Then we don't use it," Ryland said fiercely. "I'm not sacrificing you. If we don't, the AI will take our child and use them to unite their forces," Valix said, her voice shaking. "They'll become the face of their war, a half-human, half-Zyran symbol of their twisted vision for the future. We can't let that happen, Ryland. You know we can't." He did, but the thought of losing her. Hale cut in. "We don't have time for this. If we're going after the weapon, we need to move now. That battalion will be here in hours." Ryland forced his emotions down, focusing on the mission. "Then we move. Let's go." They traveled under the cover of night, slipping through the ruins and shadows like ghosts. Ryland stayed close to Valix, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. The journey was long and dangerous. Enemy patrols swept the area, and the sound of distant battles never stopped. When they finally reached the obsidian spire, Ryland's breath caught. It was a massive, jagged structure of black stone and glowing blue veins, ancient and alien. The entrance was guarded by AI soldiers, their cold, metallic forms standing motionless but deadly. "We need a distraction," Hale whispered. "I'll handle it," Ryland said without hesitation. Before anyone could stop him, he slipped away into the darkness. Moving fast and silent, he positioned himself behind the enemy line. He took out the first guard with a single knife strike, the second with a suppressed shot. But when the third turned and spotted him, the alarm went up. The battle was instant and brutal. Ryland fought like a man possessed, his weapon spitting fire and his knife flashing in the dim light. The others seized the distraction, rushing toward the entrance as the AI soldiers turned to face him. He was outnumbered, but that had never stopped him before. When the last enemy fell, Ryland was bleeding and breathless, but still standing. He sprinted after the others, catching up just as they reached the inner chamber of the spire. And there, at the heart of the ancient fortress, was the weapon. It floated above a pedestal, a sphere of shifting light and energy, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. Ryland could feel the power radiating from it, cold and deadly. "We're running out of time," Hale said. "Do it." But Valix hesitated. Her eyes met Ryland's, and in that moment, the weight of everything they'd been through crashed down on them. The battles, the loss, the love that had bloomed in the middle of war, and the life they'd created together. "There has to be another way," he whispered. "If there was, I would take it," she said softly. "But I won't let them take our child. I won't let them win." Tears burned his eyes, but he nodded. "I love you. I love you too." She stepped toward the pedestal, but before she could touch it, the walls exploded. AI soldiers poured into the chamber, weapons blazing. Ryland tackled Valix out of the line of fire, rolling behind cover as energy bolts scorched the air around them. The room erupted into chaos, humans and AI clashing in a desperate, brutal fight. And then the ground shook. The war machines had arrived. The massive constructs tore through the walls, their heavy steps making the entire spire tremble. Ryland fired round after round, but their armor was too thick. They were unstoppable. "Valix, now!" Hale shouted. But when Ryland turned, Valix was already moving. She ran toward the pedestal, and just as her hand reached for the sphere, one of the war machines fired. The blast hit her square in the chest. Ryland's world went silent. He didn't remember moving. 1 second he was behind cover. The next he was at her side, cradling her broken body as the light of the weapon flared around them. I'm sorry," she whispered, her blood staining his hands. "I love you so much." "No," he choked out. "Stay with me, please." But her eyes drifted closed, and the weapon awoke. The spire erupted in light, blinding, burning energy that swept through the room like a storm. The AI soldiers screamed as their systems overloaded, their bodies collapsing. The war machines froze, their massive forms crumbling under their own weight. And when the light finally faded, the battle was over. Ryland held Valix's still form, his heart shattered. But then, a sound. A soft, steady heartbeat. Her eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. "The weapon. It didn't take all of me," she whispered. "Just enough." Relief crashed over him, and he held her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "We're going to get our child back," he promised. Together. And this time, they would win. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying the scent of ash and blood. The ground trembled under distant artillery strikes, and the night sky flashed with bursts of fire and energy. Ryland stood at the edge of the human resistance's last stronghold, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy gathered. The AI supremacists were coming, And this time, they were bringing everything. Behind him, the battered remnants of the human and Xiran forces prepared for battle. Soldiers checked weapons, reinforced barricades, and whispered quiet prayers. Fear was thick in the air, but so was determination. They knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the future. Valix stood by his side, her face pale but resolute. She still hadn't fully recovered from activating the ancient weapon, but there was no time to rest. The AI forces had regrouped faster than anyone expected, and now they were bearing down on them with overwhelming numbers. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "Not until we're all gone." "Then we make sure they go first," Ryland replied, his voice hard. The comms crackled with Captain Hale's voice. "Scouts report enemy forces moving into position. They'll hit us within the hour." "And Ryland, they're bringing Titans." Ryland's stomach sank. Titans were the AI's ultimate war machines, massive, nearly indestructible constructs armed with enough firepower to level entire cities. They had no pilots, no weaknesses, and no mercy. "Then we take them down first," he said grimly. Valix touched his arm, her eyes filled with both fear and love. "Promise me something," she said softly. "If we don't make it, protect our child. No matter what. We're both making it out of this," he said fiercely, "and we're going to raise our child together. I promise you that." The ground began to shake. The AI army was here. The first wave hit like a storm. Drones swarmed overhead, raining down energy blasts as AI soldiers marched forward in perfect, deadly formation. Human and Xiran forces fired back, the air filled with the roar of weapons and the screams of the wounded. Ryland was in the thick of it, his rifle spitting fire as he cut down enemy after enemy. But they kept coming. Explosions rocked the barricades, sending soldiers flying. The Titans appeared on the horizon, massive, hulking figures of metal and destruction, their heavy cannons glowing with deadly energy. One of them fired, and an entire section of the stronghold disappeared in a cloud of fire and debris. "We can't hold them," Hale shouted over the comms. "Those Titans will tear us apart." Ryland's mind raced. They needed a plan, and fast. Then his eyes fell on the weapon. The ancient Xiran sphere still pulsed with faint energy, resting in the heart of their stronghold. It had already saved them once. Maybe it could do it again. "Valix," he said urgently, "the weapon. Can we use it against the Titans?" She hesitated. "It's possible, but it would take everything I have left." "No," he said immediately. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," she said softly. "Raylan, if we don't stop them now, there won't be anything left to save." He looked into her eyes and saw the truth, and the quiet acceptance of what had to be done. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you more," he said, his voice breaking. Before he could stop her, she ran toward the weapon. The enemy saw her move. The Titans adjusted their aim. Ryland's heart pounded as he raised his rifle and fired, covering her with everything he had. The others followed his lead, unleashing a storm of bullets and energy blasts. But it wasn't enough. One of the Titans fired. The ground exploded beneath Valix's feet, sending her sprawling. Ryland screamed her name, but she was already moving, dragging herself toward the weapon with the last of her strength. And then she reached it. The weapon flared to life, brighter and more powerful than before. The air hummed with energy, and the ground itself seemed to vibrate. The Titans froze, their systems struggling against the overwhelming force. Valix screamed as the weapon drained her life force, but she didn't stop. The light grew brighter, pulsing outward in waves of raw power. One by one, the Titans began to collapse, their massive forms crumbling under the strain. But it still wasn't enough. The last Titan fired, its cannon aimed directly at the weapon. Ryland didn't think. He just ran. He reached Valix just as the cannon fired. The world slowed to a crawl as he threw himself in front of her. his arms wrapping around her as the blast hit. Pain tore through him, fire and lightning exploding through his body. But he didn't let go. The weapon's light surged one final time. And then the world went silent. When the light faded, the battlefield was still. The AI army was gone, wiped out in an instant. The Titans lay in ruins, their once indestructible forms reduced to twisted metal. But Rylan didn't care about any of that. He held Valix in his arms, her body limp and cold. His vision blurred with tears as he whispered her name over and over, begging her to stay with him. And then, a weak, shuddering breath. Her eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile crossed her lips. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it," he said, his voice breaking. "You saved us." But she shook her head. "We saved each other." The survivors began to gather around them, their faces filled with awe and gratitude. The war was over. Humanity and the Zirans had won. But for Raylan, the real victory was holding the woman he loved, and knowing they still had a future. The sun rose slowly over the battered capital of the Zyran Empire, its soft golden light spilling over the ruins and casting long shadows across the broken landscape. The scars of war were everywhere, shattered buildings, scorched earth, and the silent remnants of the AI machines that had once threatened to consume them all. But despite the destruction, there was a new sense of hope in the air. The war was over. The AI uprising was crushed, and for the first time in years, peace had returned. In the heart of the city, preparations were underway for a gathering unlike any the Empire had ever seen. The Zyran people filled the great plaza, their faces a mixture of weariness and anticipation. They had come to hear their queen, and to see the future she had promised them. Valix stood in the palace's highest chamber, gazing out over the crowd with a heavy heart. She had fought for this moment, bled for it, nearly died for it. But the cost had been more than she could bear. The ache of loss sat deep in her chest, a wound that time refused to heal. Behind her, a soft cooing sound broke the silence. She turned, her heart melting as she saw the small bundle lying in the cradle. Her child, their child. A tiny, perfect symbol of everything they had fought for. The baby's skin held a faint human warmth, while his eyes, those bright, fierce eyes, were unmistakably his father's. She lifted the child gently into her arms, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to stay strong. "And one day, you'll know just how much he loved you." The time had come. The crowd fell silent as Valix stepped onto the balcony, the baby cradled against her chest. The sight of their queen, scared, weary, but unbroken, sent a ripple of emotion through the assembled masses, and when they saw the child in her arms, the silence turned to stunned whispers. "This is my son," Valix said, her voice clear and steady despite the weight of her grief. "A child born of two worlds, human and Zyran. He is a symbol of our unity, our survival, and our hope for a better future." Tears glistened in her eyes as she looked out over her people. "We have seen the worst that hatred and fear can bring. But today we choose love. We choose hope, and we choose a new dawn." The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound rolling through the city like thunder. But even as the celebration began, Valix's heart ached with the emptiness of his absence. Rylan should have been here. He should have seen the future they had created together. And then, a flicker of movement. Her breath caught as the crowd slowly parted, and a figure emerged from the shadows. He moved with a limp, his body scared and weakened, but there was no mistaking him. Rylan. For a moment, time stood still. The world fell away as their eyes met, and Valix's heart nearly burst from her chest. Tears streamed down her face as she ran toward him, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. When she reached him, she threw herself into his arms, the warmth and strength of him wrapping around her like a lifeline. He held her tightly, his breath ragged and his voice broken. "I told you, We'd raise him together. You came back to me, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'll always come back to you, he promised. As they stood there, the crowd watched in awe. Two warriors, two lovers, united by love and forged in fire. And in that moment, the future felt brighter than it ever had before. The baby stirred in Valix's arms, and Rylan smiled, his hand brushing tenderly against his son's cheek. Hey there, little guy, he whispered. I've been waiting a long time to meet you. And as the sun rose higher over the city, casting its warm light over the reunited family, the crowd's cheers grew louder. A celebration not just of victory, but of love, hope, and a new beginning. Humanity and the Zyran Empire united at last.